Next, we remember former Speaker of the House Tom Foley, who died today.
The Democrat from Washington State was known for his ability to bridge the partisan divide and bring consensus to the House.
What led him to make history as the first Speaker of the House from west of the Rockies was not luck. It was his ability to find common ground with his colleagues across the aisle.
When there were issues upon which we could not agree, we could at least use common courtesy in the way we conducted our politics. That isn't just good manners, it's good politics.
As a leader, he believed he should build and not tear down, reconcile and not divide. He stood for the principles of diplomacy and mutual respect, even toward his opposition.
It was his sense of fairness, his port in a storm bearing that will always stand out for me.
Tom Foley, as nice as he was, as civil as he was, as much as he loved his colleagues of both parties, was one tough guy.
Speaker Foley never compromised on the conviction to do right by the American people.
He believed that the Speaker was the Speaker for the whole House, and he lived that to his very core.
There was a time when Congress was not just a battleground for partisan politics, but a place where people with different beliefs could work out their differences and even find common goals.
I remember the first speaker I knew, John McCormick, saying one time to us, if you come to the Capitol in the morning, rain or shine, winter or summer, and you see the Capitol, and you don't have a sense of elation, quiet elation, of the great honor you have in representing 600,000 so of your fellow citizens. If that feeling passes, McCormick said, quit. You stayed too long.
But in recent years, things have changed.
I saw what Gingrich wanted to turn it into. He was not the leader at the time. He was sowing the seeds of discontent, literally trying to get Americans to not trust the institution. He wanted to burn the place down, and we're still living under the ramifications of that.
Those who are here illegally.
The bipartisan respect that Tom Foley had within the House has completely eroded. It has become us and them.
Today we have to ask ourselves, is today's political conduct permanent? Is what we have today
They rigged an election.
what has to be? Tom Foley was a man of the West. His grandfather came out to Washington State working on the railroad in the early days of statehood. Tom was born in the wheat country of eastern Washington. His father was a prosecutor and then a judge. Tom was raised to respect the law, to honor institutions. Little surprise then that Tom followed his father into the law and then to a county prosecutor's office. He also followed his father's politics. Ralph Foley was a young man when FDR was first elected in the depths of the Depression. He believed Roosevelt saved the nation. This was not a belief widely shared where the Foleys lived. Ralph Foley once said his neighbors regarded him as though he belonged to a strange religion. FDR and Truman carried the West in every national election. But by 1962, Republicans controlled 6 of Washington State's 7 congressional districts. Walt Horan, who won election to a 10th term in Foley's district that fall, carried 64% of the vote.
I got an offer from Senator Jackson to come back and work as his counsel on the Interior Committee. And that was a great job, and I enjoyed it. And one night, I used to drive Scoop home because I was single, and thank you. And he would go to these receptions, and I'd drive him home. And he asked me if I might be interested in running for Congress. Well, frankly, I hadn't thought about it that much. I was enjoying Washington, D.C. I was single at the time, and it was a nice job and well paid. But I didn't want to close the conversation. So I said, well, I've been thinking about it, lying a little bit. I didn't do anything. And a few days before the filing, I went to lunch at the Spokane Club. And we were joined by Joe Drummond. And Joe was one Magnuson's kind of unpaid representative. Joe sat down, and I was explaining to the group that I wasn't going to run for Congress this year, but I'd maybe run next year. And Joe said, no, you won't. And I said, well, I'm really seriously thinking about doing it. He said, I wouldn't run. And I said, well, how do you know I wouldn't run, Joe? I get a little irritated. He said, well, you're just like all young guys today. You think that the party's going to come to you with a silver Tiffany tray and an engraved invitation, humbly begging you to run for Congress. It doesn't happen that way. You either have the manhood to do it or you don't, and you're telling me you don't. That's what you're saying when you're saying 2 years from now. And I said, well, if I ran, I'd have a primary, and I'd like to know whether I'd have your support. And he said, absolutely, you'd have my support. I called Scoop, and he wasn't available, so I left 3 telegrams, ordered 3 telegrams, sending him to resigning my job and, asking him, thanking him for et cetera, et cetera. Then I called my bank and asked what my balance was. $345 overdrawn.
Oh, boy.
I went down to Olympia to file for office. The car ran out of gas, blew a tire. We got in time to file, and I couldn't restrain myself, and about 6 o'clock I called back to the Secretary of State's office and asked if anybody had filed for the 5th District, meaning anybody else, disguising my voice. He said, well, a fellow by the name of Tom Foley filed. That's all. I said, that's all. Nope, he's the nominee. So by the close of business on the 17th of July, 1964, I was the nominee.
Today's congressional candidates, even before entering a race, hire consultants, conduct polls, and raise money through so-called exploratory campaigns. That wasn't the case when Tom Foley ran in 1964. With no campaign organization in place and no real idea of how to build one, he was bailed out by his former boss, Senator Scoop Jackson, who was running for re-election himself that year but didn't have a serious challenger.
He turned over, in effect, all of his television time to me by rewriting all his television for Eastern Washington. And he would go on the television himself and say, I'm Senator Henry Jackson, and I urge you to vote for Tom Foley for Congress.
Today's voters might be surprised by Foley's campaign strategy. When Foley ran that first race against Walt Horan, Tom didn't criticize his opponent's politics, much less make attacks on him personally.
We had the campaign that was really, I think, so unusual in that sense that there was no kind of criticism. I said, I hope to be as good a congressman as Walt was. He said that when he left Congress, which was not quite yet, he hoped to be somebody like me around. It's whatever, and he knew my parents, and they were such fine people. UPS sent a reporter up to the district to cover the campaign because it was kind of marked by compliments rather than by attacks. I think we had about $7,000 or $8,000 raised on $10 contributions, which was my entire primary budget. I had to depend a lot upon volunteers, too, and there were wonderful volunteers who came forward not only to give money but to help in the campaign. And one of them was a radio personality whose name was Tiny Talbot. And, of course, anybody whose nickname is Tiny means that he weighs 300 pounds. And this was the case with Tiny Talbot. And he had a deep radio voice. It says, Tiny Talbot, you're KFCF reporter, whatever. So we made the mistake of using him to announce me. We had a simple television program. I marched out in front of the camera and said my piece, and I was announced off camera by Tiny Talbot. So Tiny's deep, stentorian voice would announce, now, ladies and gentlemen, our new man in Congress, Tom Foley. And I would come out and sound like, ladies and gentlemen. totally bad, comparison. So I said, let's reverse it. I'll announce Tiny and he can come out. I can remember as if it was yesterday, the night I was elected, and Scoop called up from Seattle and told me that the King television computer had just awarded me the election. And, I wasn't ready to believe it yet. Before I actually went to bed that night, I did one interview over at KXLY and in Spokane. And as I was going down the steps, a guy came up and asked me to intervene in a service case for him. And I said, well, how did you know? Well, I said, I heard it on the radio. You're the new congressman, and I want your help. Yeah, I want your help. When I was sworn in, Walt came on the floor and took me in to the Democratic and the Republican cloakrooms and introduced me as his successor. That was unheard of for anybody except somebody in the same party. And the interesting thing to me was I got, in some ways, better received in the Republican cloakroom than in the Democratic cloakroom.
Foley entered the landslide Democratic Congress of 1965 that was filled with gung-ho young new members like him, but still governed by old seniority rules.
I remember when I had joined this big class in 1964 election of Democrats, and John McCormick was Speaker, and he greeted us all in this special caucus meeting and said that the leadership wasn't going to really pay too much attention to us in the first 2 years, the newly elected, because he didn't know and they didn't know whether we had been elected by accident, perhaps, rather than as a deliberate act of the electorate. So they would wait until we were reelected. And then if we were reelected, they would start to believe that maybe there was something serious about our future in the House. That was kind of a cold shower. And then there were people who came forward after the Speaker's somewhat cool greeting to give us some idea of what we ought to do and how we ought to behave. And one of them was Mike Kerwin, who was a very powerful member of the Appropriations Committee. He ran the subcommittee on appropriations that really determined whether there are any bridges or highways in your district, a very, very powerful member. And I remember him saying to us that he wanted to warn us against the single greatest danger that could accrue to a new member taking up his or her responsibility in the Congress. We thought, this must be some ethical problem or other, so we leaned forward, and he said, that danger is thinking for yourselves. For heaven's sakes, he said, don't do that. He said, trust the subcommittee chairman, trust the committee chairman, trust the chairman of the Democratic caucus, trust the Democratic whip, trust the majority leader, the Democratic leader of the House, and especially, he said, pray God, trust, respect, and follow the Speaker. I remember being really annoyed. I'd gotten elected, I thought, to make some contribution to the future of the country in whatever way I could. And here's a senior member of the Democratic Party telling us that we really ought to pay no attention to our own ideas, but only to the kind of leaders of the party. And then he went on to make it worse by saying that he thought in his experience that more people had gotten in trouble in the Congress thinking for themselves than by stealing money. And I thought, this is outrageous, just outrageous. In the ensuing years, I became a subcommittee chairman and a committee chairman and the chairman of the Democratic caucus and the Democratic whip and the Democratic majority leader. And finally, in 1989, I became the Speaker. And I remember taking the oath of office as Speaker. The wise words of Mr. Kerwin came back over a generation of time. Trust, respect, and follow the Speaker. I had won an election somewhat as an underdog, I think clearly as an underdog, so I was going back to the district every chance I got. And I would go out typically to Dulles Airport, and I would fly at night from Dulles to Atlanta, Georgia, and from Atlanta, Georgia to Seattle on another flight, and from Seattle to Spokane. So I'd leave at 10:30 at night, and I'd be in Spokane about 7 o'clock in the morning. Pretty tired, but anyway, there. And I was ready to do that one night. I was in one of these mobile lounges that goes back and forth to the aircraft at Dulles Airport, and a United agent came on board and said, is there Congressman Foley on board? And I raised my hand. Congressman Thomas Foley? Yes. Congressman Thomas S. Foley of Washington? Yes, that's me. And then in a very loud voice, he said, Mr. Congressman, President Johnson is calling for you urgently. Please come with me. We will hold the lounge. Well, frankly, I was pretty impressed because I don't think I'd formally been introduced to the president. And the fact that he was calling me, what was he calling me about? What did he want me to do or whatever? And of course, everybody in the lounge was kind of impressed too. It's a big deal. So we walked through, the agent and I walked through the terminal, and he was kind of pushing people aside, kind of make way for the commissioner style. And I got inside the office, which was between two ticket counters, and there were 3 or 4 people working there, and he kind of made them all leave. And out. And then he sort of bowed himself out and shut the door, and I saw this telephone with the phone off the hook, and I picked it up. And the voice on the other end said, Congressman Foley? I said, yes, Thomas Foley of Washington, yes. Mr. Congressman, this is the White House switchboard. Would you hold now for the president? And a few seconds later, a familiar Texas voice comes on the line and said, John? And I said, no, Mr. President, Tom Foley. And I can't say this at the table, it would be a little impolite to do, but there followed a string of 4-letter words that would make a sailor blush, as the line goes, ending with a long 4-letter word pronounced in 2 syllables beginning with S, which said, I wanted John Fogerty of Rhode Island, not you. The phone was hung up. It was the most depressing moment of my political career up to that point, and I was literally kind of shaking. And then I still had the smoking habit, so I smoked a couple of cigarettes and sort of calmed down. And suddenly I realized I had a brilliant thought. Nobody else knows, just the president and me and one poor White House telephone operator who was probably catching hell for it because they have a reputation for getting the right person wherever he or she is. And so I squared my shoulders and I walked out, and the agent outside, the United agent, said, have you finished your conversation with President Johnson? And I could truthfully say, yes, the president and I have finished our conversation. So he walked back to the lounge with me, rode out to the plane with me, whispered in the ear of the flight attendant, please upgrade Mr. Foley from economy to first class at the convenience of United Airlines. He has just had a very important conversation with the President of the United States.
Jim O'Hara, Congressman Jim O'Hara said, former congressman, said to me one time, he said, Tom Foley is a good friend. Smart man, great legislative mind, but most important, he's a good friend.
Well, one of the things I kind of believe in politics is that the issues are tough enough without getting personal about it, without getting harsh. And I think too often today the campaigns are run on negative issues rather than positive issues. And maybe it's too much to expect that will change too fast. I think it's contributed to a kind of devaluation by the public of the whole process. When they listen to campaign ads, they kind of out negative the other side, and sometimes get very, very personal, attack not only the position, but the credibility and the character and so on of candidates. I've tried and I hope successfully avoided that.
Tom Foley, for the farmer, for everyone.
Foley was considered by many to be very cautious and always wanting to look at all sides of an argument. He was highly respected.
This became not so much an aspect of Foley's political style, but the style itself. Welcome all ideas from wherever they arrived and hash it out with respect, but also with determination to find solutions. Foley's style also held to an unshakable principle. You did what you said you would, and you took your licks.
Well, there's always a famous problem of members telling the truth to leaders or would-be leaders of the party when they're running for office. And Mo Udall ran for Speaker against John McCormick in 1968. And I was pledged to support Mo. And I had a very uncomfortable conversation with Speaker McCormick, who went to the unusual extent of calling everybody and asking them for their support. I had to try to be honest with him and tell him that I, in effect, wasn't going to vote for him. I was going to vote for Udall. That was the year Heather and I were married, and we were married in what was then Ceylon. And we were kind of taking a honeymoon in Ceylon, in the northern parts of Ceylon. And I got panicky that I was going to miss the vote in the House, that it was going to come up, and that Mo was going to lose by 1 vote, and I would never forgive myself, and he would never forgive me if I wasn't present. So we went racing back across the world, stopping in places like Egypt and in Paris and in London, and then, you know, coming back to the United States. And I cast my vote, and Mo lost by about 93 to 160. And Mo expressed his appreciation to the 145 members who had pledged to support him, and especially the 93 who voted for him. To some extent, candidates today are told, and there is some truth to it, that up to a point, negative campaigns work. That's what they're told. And you may not like it, and you may feel uncomfortable about it, but if you want to win this election, you're going to be faced with a negative campaign. You have to be ready to fire back or whatever. And so campaigns very often degenerate very quickly into personal attacks, into misrepresentations of the record and position of the other candidate, of even in a recent race bringing in the comments by the former wife and, you know, all that sort of stuff, which really, I think, ultimately turn off the public. But there's nothing they can do about it because this is what they're presented with. Maybe it's too Pollyannish to think that we're all going to get back into a time when there's no negative aspects. And legitimate differences over policy are okay, I think. But often they're hyped up and made very, very emotional. And hot button issues like immigration or crime or abortion or gun control or other issues that tend to have an emotional overtone can create really immediate reactions. I've kind of been on both sides of some of these issues for a long time. I was endorsed by the NRA when I was running for Congress, and when I was an NRA endorsed member, I used to have people come up to me that I think probably would never have voted for me otherwise and take my hand and thank me and so forth. And then when I voted on assault weapons bill in a way the NRA didn't like, I got kind of the other end of it. But, you know, it's okay, I think, to have strong differences over policy. But when they're characterized, I remember people used to run up and down in that last election with, when I was riding in a car with pictures of Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and me. And there used to, there used to be in small towns big window fronts from some real estate firm or something that have a huge target. And the 10 spot was my picture. So, you know, sort of getting the impression that this is not a welcome sign.
Tom told me one time, he said, when I came here, they put me on the agriculture committee because I had wheat farmers. And he said, you know, I was a lawyer from Seattle. I didn't belong in the wheat. But he said, I found out every kind of wheat there was, and I knew every rust that affects wheat, and I knew everything about wheat.
He knew as much about wheat, or maybe more than I did, even though I grew wheat for a while.
Foley's personal style and outright friendliness helped propel his success.
Smart, capable, although he looked like a tough old dog, he was underneath a teddy bear.
Tom was a collaborator, and I think he had demonstrated that to his colleagues. I think he earned the positions that he got with the U.S. House of Representatives on the basis of a good guy and a smart leader.
One of Foley's lasting legislative legacies was a compromise he engineered that overcame a long-standing urban-rural divide involving food stamps and agricultural subsidies.
Well, that's one of the largest bills outside of defense and the foreign aid bill. Tom did a magnificent job of bringing the different pieces of the coalition that wanted a bill that weren't in agreement. So you had subsidies and insurance programs that the farmers basically really wanted. And then on the other hand, the committee had food stamps, the nutrition assistance program. So it's a huge bill.
The other thing that was always true about the district is that it's an area where people live a different life than people live in urban areas. For a time, for example, I represented Omak, Washington, Okanagan County. And just as kids in Norway learn to ski when they're 5 or 3, people learn to ride in Omak when they're 3 or 5. And the Omak Stampede is one of the great, rodeos of the country. And somebody approached me when I was in my early years in the House and said, we'd like to have you be the Grand Marshal of the Omak Stampede next year. And so I said, that's a great honor. I'd love to do that. And they said, well, don't worry, we'll have a car for you to ride in. And I said, I don't want to ride a car. I don't want to ride in the car. I want to ride a horse. I mean, this is the Omak Stampede. So somebody mumbled something. Anyway, I arrived in Omak and I had my Levi's on and my work jacket, which is kind of a cowboy jacket on, and I had my 5-gallon. I looked pretty Western. And they had a big Oldsmobile convertible for pick me up. And I said, I thought I was going to ride a horse. And they said, well, that comes later at the Stampede. So we had lunch, and then we went over to the Stampede. And they had a beautiful sorrel-colored quarter horse with a silver-studded saddle and bridle. And I leapt on the back of that critter and looked pretty much like Tom Mix, I thought. I mean, I looked pretty good in my Western outfit. And the beautiful horse. The horse was a really good-looking horse. And they brought up 2 young women, one who was the princess from the Colville Indian Reservation, and the other one was the queen of the Omak Stampede. We all go up to the gate, and I think we're going to walk around the rodeo ground. And the gate opens, and a gun goes off, and these 2 girls take off at full gallop. And they're both trick riders. And they're waving under the horse, and they're reversing position and standing up on the horse, and all kinds of fantastic things. And I'm coming along, I thought, I'd ridden as a kid, and I thought it'll come back. It's like riding a bicycle. Well, not quite that fast. And so anyway, after going around a couple of times and looking very clumsy compared to these wonderful riders who were both of these young women, we finally get back, and I think, oh, God, I'm glad that's over. And they brought up 50 guys, the Omak Sheriff's posse, and they all have American flags, and they all have big Western saddles. And so I thought, well, this has got to be slow. And we're going to go twice around. Wrong. Full gallop, we're doing this full gallop. And one of the sheriff's deputies' flags gets in front of my horse's head, and the horse shies. And suddenly, I'm out there all alone. They've all disappeared by this time. And I'm trying to get a hold of one rein that I've dropped and a stirrup I've lost. And I'm in a cloud of dust out there in the center of the ring. And the Western announcer is saying, well, folks, I guess you can all see that a good Congressman, Tom Foley, hasn't been wasting his time and money back in Washington taking riding lessons. So the crowd cheers and hoots and whistles and claps. And I wanted to get out of town by the first available transportation. I was totally humiliated. And the drunk came up out of the stands and grabbed me and said, Tom, I didn't know, boy, you could ride. But my administrative assistant then told me, he said, that was wonderful. And I said, what do you mean it was wonderful? I said, I made a fool of myself. And he said, exactly. You did. That's why it's wonderful. If you had come up here from Spokane and ridden just like some kind of rodeo star, reared the horse up and pranced all around the place, they'd hate you. They have the pleasure and the privilege of looking down on you and having pity on you as a city boy who doesn't know how to ride a horse. And they will vote for you in this next election. We don't have to, and I never lost Okanagan County as a result.
Tom had this great intellect. He was a statesman, and he also was a great storyteller. When he started telling a story, you knew that it was going to be a little bit of the behind-the-scenes humor that happens in the day-to-day. If you can see the humor in the situation and get people to laugh together, maybe you can take a breath and now look at the same problem a little differently.
Foley was just completely honorable and fair and worked with both sides of the aisle.
If we were in a meeting with leadership, Tom would take the other side's position and he would argue it for them in the presence of his leadership. So we would learn and understand their arguments a little bit better.
But Tip O'Neill once said about me, Tom Foley can see three sides of every issue. That was not meant to be a Tip O'Neill compliment, by the way.
He and Bob Michael had a unique relationship.
When Tom became Speaker, he suggested that we get together once a week, talk over the affairs of the House, something that had never been done before. While we disagreed over policy and jousted with each other politically, the meetings were highly productive because underlying them was the faith and trust we had in each other. He knew that if we wanted to be effective in the House, you just can't go around shouting your principles. You have to subject those principles to the test of open debate against those who do not share those principles.
I am confident in the fundamental honesty and integrity of the members who serve here. I believe the standard of public conduct is higher, and the performance of that standard is better in this House today than any other time in the history of our nation.
And that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which you are about to enter. So help you God.
I do, so help me God.
When I was Speaker, I used to encourage members, particularly Democrats that I was speaking to in this orientation period, to get to know Republican members. There's too much today of coming in on Tuesday and leaving on Thursday, and members don't really get acquainted across the aisle and across party lines. And thinking that there was no press present, I decided, it was, I guess, the 102nd Congress, and I was Speaker about 1992, perhaps, to suggest that Democrats do two things. One is that if they hadn't thought about doing it, that maybe they ought to very soon in their career miss a vote. Not an important vote, not a significant vote for their district, but perhaps some procedural vote, so that they will never be tempted to try to have a 100% voting record, which if they stay a long time is not really a signal of good service, but more like kind of perfect attendance is to a grade school student. It doesn't mean you're a good scholar. The other thing I told the members to do on this occasion was to sort of make it impossible for them to, even if they decide they wanted to be able to vote every time and then have a choice sometime in their career of missing their sister's wedding or their whatever graduation in order to come and vote on some routine bill. The other thing I suggested was to take a trip, because if they hadn't pledged never to do it, that travel for legitimate reasons in the Congress to learn more about our operations in other parts of the country or other parts of the world was also a way to get to know Republicans. Because we sit on opposite sides of the aisle, we sit at different tables even in the private dining room often, and there's just very little chance to understand that there, as I said to the members, there are great Republican members in the House. You will find if you get to know them that they're fully as committed to the country's future as you are. And you may, if you want a political reason, think about the fact that you'll get a vote from across the aisle sometime later on in your career for no other reason than you took a trip together and you got acquainted, and something that's not important to that Republican and very important to you results in some help. Anyway, there was a reporter there, and the AP the next day said that I had given the members of the 102nd Congress the advice of miss a vote and take a junket. And one of our famous national television networks, Fair and Balanced, said the next day that they were shocked that the Speaker of the House had told the new members to miss as many votes as they could, but never miss a chance to take a publicly financed trip abroad.
He was able to get legislation enacted, and he was able to work with the Republicans.
He's a man of integrity, decency, fair play. And okay, he's a Democrat, but he's a man I am very proud and honored to work with.
I think people, of course, have a different idea of what the right thing to do is, but they want the two parties to cooperate and not to just be at loggerheads all the time, and to put what they view as the country's welfare and interests first, and their own political situation on a lesser scale. And I think basically there's still a strong kind of consensus that sometimes can be developed in the country about how to proceed. When I was a young lawyer, I was always impressed with the good judgment of juries. You know, in difficult cases, the juries were able to sort out a lot of conflicting facts and come to a decision that lawyers on both sides could think of as positive of the issues. And I think today, many times the country wants to see a kind of an effort to reach, on the big issues of the day, some agreement and some consensus.
The entire time I was in the Senate, there were anywhere from 10 to 15 Republicans who were more liberal than the 10 to 15 most conservative Democrats. There was that overlap of 20 or 25 people. In the last quite a number of years now, there's been zero overlap. The most liberal Republican is still more conservative than the most conservative Democrat in the Senate.
And I used to think somewhat, I think probably perversely, that if I didn't vote sometime during the session on something which was going to get me some difficulty or problem politically, I wasn't doing the job. If everything is agreeable, if you never have a tough vote, then you have to really ask yourself, are you taking a really hard look at this? Because it's unlikely that a member of Congress will go through a whole session and everything is easy and everything is fine and it's all comfortable and you're never called on to make a tough call or take a risk. I did have the opportunity to serve with presidents from Lyndon Johnson to Bill Clinton. And by the way, I think although each one of them has been in some way controversial, I think the country overall has been well served by presidents in both parties. Our president has, I think, the difficult role of being the head of state and also the head of government and also the principal leader of his party and also the commander-in-chief of all the armed forces and also the chief maker of foreign policy and also the spokesman for the country on the worldwide bully pulpit that the presidency is. Lyndon Johnson was a tremendous figure. He was sort of almost physically intimidating. He was a very big man, bigger than his pictures indicate. He was 6'4" tall, husky man, and he had a kind of a dominating presence. He did many important things, I think, when he was president. One of the things he did that I thought was to his eternal reputation, he really moved to make this a true democracy by encouraging the passage of the Voting Rights Act, which did more than any other single act to allow people of all racial backgrounds and circumstances in the United States to have a full citizenship and a role in selecting the government of the country. It was very hard not to like Ronald Reagan, even when he was kind of attacking the Democrats in a speech to a joint session of Congress. You kind of felt, well, he doesn't really mean it. You know, he's got to do a certain amount of this. He had this kind of warm side that revealed a lot at the state funeral. Three of the brightest, quickest, I think, were Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. All of them very, very intellectually quick and talented. And I found myself admiring the intellectual capacities of all three of them, particularly. President Bush 41 made a decision to support a tax increase, which he had pledged in the words to the convention, "Read my lips, no taxes." And that undoubtedly hurt him in the election of 1992. I thought, frankly, it was in so many ways his finest hour. Not because of the issue, but because of his determination, I think, that whatever risk he might take personally, this was the right thing for the country. At the time, he made that decision. And that's the greater responsibility, particularly of presidents. It's one thing sometimes to think, well, if you always keep your word and you never violate it, and that's the highest responsibility. But the president's the single person charged most of all with protecting the republic and preserving the security of the American people and tending to their business first, last, and always. And it's better, I think, for a president, and certainly very courageous, I think, and noble of a president, to put that interest before his own political interest. When I was ambassador in Japan, Bill Clinton came out 3 times while I was there, and one time to the 2000 G8 meeting, which was held in Okinawa. He flew all night to Okinawa, and there I met him and flew with him on the Marine One, the helicopter, to the first stop, which was a memorial of those who died in the Battle of Okinawa. And I told him on the way out that I told him it was a very good speech that I'd read the text of, but it had 3 errors, including the numbers of people who died in these battles. He didn't write anything down and got off the helicopter and walked around for about 20 minutes, got up and made a speech, and just from that one hearing, recounted absolutely accurately the 16 or 17 digit numbers, 2, 6, and 1 of 5 of those who died in the battle. He was very, very quick. When you would brief him on a subject, he would appear not to be paying attention, but the moment you repeated yourself, he would tell you you'd said that before.
The first of what are now routine big budget crises occurred when Foley was Speaker. In part through his guidance, the entire leadership of the Congress, both parties, would climb aboard buses and head off to some undisclosed location and hammer out the issues. The philosophy was that when a tough decision has to be made, it's better if you can get both sides of the aisle to share in it.
The Clinton budget wound up with 3 balanced budgets, and the prospect of being able to retire the national debt, the money that had been borrowed. And to me, I think that was one of the greatest accomplishments of any president in recent history.
I remember being on the floor begging literally members to vote for the budget, who were concerned about it, who knew when they voted that they might well be putting their seat at risk. Fatal risk. And, I think when members of Congress do that, it really is quite an extraordinary act of political courage. If you ask somebody in business, put your whole company on the line. Make a bet on a decision or an investment, which if it succeeds will be very important, and if it fails, it'll wipe out the company. You're careful before you do that. It's something that happens rarely, but it happens once in a while in both politics and business, where you have to make those key decisions that are very critical and very dangerous. And I was very proud of the House that night, and I think it did. It was a budget that had a lot to do with the successful surpluses that resulted.
Foley was charming, jovial, but in public almost always slightly formal. It was part of his father's heritage. If you are the judge, look and act like a judge. If you're a congressman, look and act like a congressman.
Sometimes I think there's too harsh a message delivered when people give these 1-minute speeches at the beginning of the day and sort of on the attack mode. But it kind of gives the impression of the two parties at loggerheads, and to a degree it's increasingly, unfortunately, a real impression. But there was also the behind-the-scenes efforts of the party leadership to work together. And particularly when I was Speaker, I had the great pleasure and honor of having Bob Michael, who was the Republican leader and I think one of the really extraordinary members of Congress in my experience. He was a strong defender of the Republican position. He was not in any way reluctant to take a tough argument and a tough debate to the floor, and sometimes was successful. Not always was the majority something that could be accomplished without some concession on our part. So I thought he was a very effective leader, but he was also one who always kind of put the interest of the country first. And when we were voting in the first Gulf War vote, I voted against the resolution and Bob voted for it. But he came up to the podium where I was sitting. Bob always wore the infantryman's combat infantry badge very proudly. He was a proud infantry soldier in the Second World War. And he's a big, tough guy. And he had tears in his eyes. And he said that, this was the hardest vote he thinks he'd cast as long as he'd been in Congress, because he realized that by casting it, he might be putting young men and women in harm's way. And that's a terrible and difficult responsibility. And he thought it was the right thing to do, and he was doing it without regret, but he also worried about what would be the consequence.
I think Tom always lived by the rule that people who serve in Congress ought to have two rules as to personal comportment. Number one is don't get personal, don't engage in demonization of people with whom you disagree. And number two, always look for common ground.
Always looking for people to look at the virtue they could find in themselves. So he didn't look at the negative in people, he looked in the positive, and he's always encouraging people to find the positive.
When tragedy struck at the Fairchild Air Force Base Hospital in his district, this longtime defender of gun rights saw the need for sensible gun violence prevention laws. Speaker Foley brought that bill to the floor. He helped enact those bans, knowing that it would not be well received in his district. But he did what he believed, and he did it with courage.
Foley was an institutionalist to his core, as had been many of his predecessors in leadership positions. But an insurgency was building from below. Not just new ideas, but a radical new style. In 1994, 5 years into his speakership, the revolutionaries were winning the war in Congress. Foley continued to guide the House as firmly as he could, but his grasp was slipping.
How much of the American people will be inconvenienced? How many school programs and education facilities and airports will be closed down to satisfy the gentleman's desire for fiscal responsibility in a week when we are trying to get an ultimate solution to this problem and not play further games with the American people, the federal budget, or federal workers?
It's important for us who feel a responsibility to fight for a cause to recognize that our cause is not advanced if we can't also try to achieve compromise. That's what Tom Foley believed. That's what he embodied. That's the legacy that shines brightly today. First time I visited Capitol Hill, Tom Foley was Speaker. I was a very young man and I was doing community work, and I remember seeing that Capitol and having that same sense of wonder. I think now about Tom Foley being here, doing that work, and inspiring what might have ultimately led me to be interested in public service as well. When we're standing outside these magnificent buildings, we have that sense of wonder and that sense of hope. And sometimes the longer you're here, the harder it is to hang on to that. And yet, Tom Foley never lost it. Never lost that sense of wonder, never lost the sense of gratitude.
Tom Foley served for 30 years in Congress, half of them in leadership, the last 5 as Speaker. In the end, his commitment to doing the right thing cost him. Even as he knew it might, he did it anyway.
I want to say, first of all, Garrick, I'm very, very surprised by what Tom Foley just said. According to
as Gingrich got more and more partisan, members on the Democratic side were mad at Tom because they said you're too even-handed. You keep treating them like they're, like they're co-equals here. And Tom said, that's the way it's been for 200 years, and I'm not going to change it, I'll tell you that. We're not going to turn this into a partisan food fight.
Neither Newt Gingrich nor
When we succeeded in putting the assault weapons ban back into the crime bill, he said, you can leave this in here, but there will be a lot of blood on the floor if we pass this. Many of us will not survive. And I'll never forget the argument I had. I said, Tom, I'm from Arkansas. Both my senators voted for this. I'm still going to carry it next time. He said, yeah. He said, in 4 years, it's the same thing with your economic plan. People will see that it works, and people will see that they didn't lose their guns and they still got to defend their homes and go hunting and be in sports shooting contests. But we'll all have to run before they know any of that. We have enough uncertainty now. If you put this in there, there'll be a lot of carnage. And I thought he was wrong, but he was right. And he lost that election by 4,000 votes. Was it worth his public service? We had 8 years of declining violent crime for the first time in the history of the country. We did prove that this didn't interfere with people's Second Amendment rights, but the price was high. What I want to tell you is he walked clear-eyed into the House, and we put those votes together, and the crime bill passed. And those of us who supported it at least think America was much better off as a result. But he knew.
The assault weapons ban was a great achievement. It saved thousands of lives. But Foley was right. It cost him his job.
Well, I remember people being very surprised, coming from where he came from, that he went out and helped to get an assault weapons ban passed, because politically it was really challenging for him.
Given Foley's temperament, he might have thought that was a good outcome. Be straight with the people, do what you must, take the hard vote, and live with the outcome. Not long after the election, Foley and other congressional leaders sent a letter to President Clinton, asking that he propose a major piece of trade legislation be addressed in the lame duck session of Congress.
He was, in short, dying inside, heartbroken, and he still showed up for work. And he still believed that the purpose of political service was to get the show on the road.
At a time when our political system can seem more polarized and more divided than ever before, it can be tempting to see the possibility of bipartisan progress as a thing of the past, old school. It can be tempting to wonder if we still have room for leaders like Tom, whether the environment, the media, the way that districts are drawn, and the pressures that those of us in elected office are under somehow preclude the possibility of that brand of leadership. Well, I believe we have to find our way back there.
Politics has issues that shouldn't be glossed over. They are important issues. And some ability to see both sides of an issue, I think, is important, because on most of the issues, there are two sides. We have to find a way to talk about them and to differ about them without creating a culture of not only a personal attack, but of kind of not able to understand at all, how somebody can take a different position. There are considerations that justify these different positions, and people who hold them aren't either virtuous on one side and evil on the other.